respond to your points from the Russian Federation. We did not reject your request for a meeting. We received your letter on Sunday, and it is the responsibility, the obligation of the Presidency to schedule a meeting. You particularly requested a meeting for a time on Monday. Our proposal as Presidency was to schedule the meeting either alongside the meeting today, so well within the 48-hour limit, which is the convention of the Security Council, or to hold the meetings sequentially, one after the other. And I understand that the Russian Federation turned down both proposals, but I wish to be clear that we did not reject the request for a meeting. The deferral proposed was less than 24 hours, and to be clear, we share the view that this is an urgent situation, and we have, as I say, offered the Russian Federation either a separate meeting today or to combine it with this one. And so, as far as the Presidency is concerned, we did everything in line with the provisional rules of procedure and with precedent. We have received no other complaints from Council members on the subject. I give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Благодарю вас. У нас есть доказательства,
we have proof,
фактические доказательства того, что это было
factual proof,
не менее чем за 24 часа до заседания, которое мы просили провести.
That this was not less than 24 hours before the meeting.
Если это кому-то интересно, мы готовы это представить.
We have the proof. And if anyone is interested, we're ready to show our proof. But I want to express my hope. Based on what you said, you will not anymore refuse member states in holding meetings when they request to go to those meetings. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation. The Presidency will not refuse to host meetings in the future, and I hope that that now closes that point and we can proceed with the adoption of the agenda. The provisional agenda for this meeting is letter dated the 28th of February 2014 from the Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the United Nations, addressed to the President of the Security Council, S/2014/136. The agenda is adopted. I should like to start by taking the opportunity to pay tribute on behalf of this Council to Her Excellency Lana Naseba, the Permanent Representative of the United Arab Emirates, for your service as the President of the Council for the month of March. I'm sure I speak for all of us in expressing our deep appreciation to Ambassador Naseba and her team for the skillful conduct of the Council's business last month. Thank you very much indeed to your team. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. On behalf of the Council, I welcome the participation of His Excellency Mr. Volodymyr Zelensky, the President of Ukraine, and just add that, as usual precedent, the Permanent Representative of Ukraine will also join the meeting in case of any technical issues. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting: Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under-Secretary-General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, and Mr. Martin Griffiths, Under-Secretary-General for Humanitarian Affairs, Emergency Relief Coordinator. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Olof Skog, Head of Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to warmly welcome His Excellency the Secretary-General, His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres, and I give him the floor.
Madam President, Excellencies, the war in Ukraine is one of the greatest challenges ever to the international order and the global peace architecture founded on the United Nations Charter, because of its nature, intensity, and consequences. We are dealing with the full-fledged invasion on several fronts of one member state of the United Nations, Ukraine, by another, the Russian Federation, a permanent member of the Security Council, in violation of the United Nations Charter, and with several aims, including redrawing the internationally recognized borders between the two countries. The war has led to senseless loss of life, massive devastation in urban centers, and the destruction of civilian infrastructure. I will never forget the horrifying images of civilians killed in Bucha, and I immediately called for an independent investigation to guarantee effective accountability. And I'm also deeply shocked by the personal testimony of rapes and sexual violence that now are emerging. The High Commissioner for Human Rights has spoken of possible war crimes, grave breaches of international humanitarian law, and serious violations of international human rights law. And the Russian offensive has also led to the displacement of more than 10 million people in just 1 month, the fastest forced population movement since the Second World War. Far beyond Ukraine's borders, the war has led to massive increases in prices of food, energy and fertilizers, because Russia and Ukraine are linchpins of these markets. It has disrupted supply chains and increased the cost of transportation, putting even more pressure on the developing world. Many developing countries are already on the verge of debt collapse due to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the lack of adequate liquidity and debt relief, stemming ultimately from the unfair nature of our global economic and financial system. For all these reasons, it is more urgent by the day to silence the guns. That is why I asked the Emergency Relief Coordinator, Martin Griffiths, to travel to Russia and Ukraine to press for an urgent humanitarian ceasefire. And the Secretary-General Griffiths will update you on the humanitarian situation and the results of his contacts so far. And the Secretary-General Di Carlo will also brief you on the political and human rights dimensions. But as Secretary-General of the United Nations, it is my duty to call the attention of the Council to the serious damage being done to the global economy and particularly to vulnerable people and developing countries. Madam President, our analysis indicates that 74 developing countries with a total population of 1.2 billion people are particularly vulnerable to spiking food, energy and fertilizer costs. Debt obligations take up some 16% of developing countries' export earnings, and in small island developing states, the figure is 34% and rising because of increased interest rates and the need to pay for expensive imports. In the past months alone, wheat prices have increased by 22%, maize by 21%, and barley by 31%. Brent oil prices on the 1st of April were more than 60% higher than at the same time last year. A series of events have led to that, not only the present situation. Natural gas and fertilizer prices more than double over the same period. We are already seeing some countries move from vulnerability into crisis and signs of serious social unrest. The flames of conflict are fueled by inequality, deprivation, and underfunding. With all the warning signals flashing red, we have a duty to act. Madam President, the Global Crisis Response Group on Food, Energy and Finance that I set up last month has formulated some initial recommendations for the consideration of Member States, international financial institutions and others. On food, we are urging all countries to keep markets open, resist unjustified and unnecessary export restrictions, and make reserves available to countries at risk of hunger and famine. This is not the time for protectionism. Humanitarian appeals must be fully funded. People caught up in crises around the world cannot pay the price for this war. On energy, the use of strategic stockpiles and additional reserves could help ease this energy crisis in the short term. But the only medium and long-term solution is to accelerate the deployment of renewable energy, which is not impacted by market fluctuations. These will allow the progressive phase-out of coal and other fossil fuels, and renewables are already cheaper in most of the cases. And on finance, international financial institutions must go into emergency mode. We need urgent action by the G20 and international financial institutions to increase liquidity and fiscal space so that governments can provide safety nets for the poorest and most vulnerable. The reform I've been calling for the global financial system is long overdue. All these actions are closely linked with the prevention agenda and with building and sustaining peace. Madam President, the war in Ukraine must stop now. We need serious negotiations for peace based on the principles of the United Nations Charter. This Council is charged with maintaining peace and doing so in solidarity. I deeply regret the divisions that have prevented the Security Council from acting not only on Ukraine, but on other threats to peace and security around the world. I urge the Council to do everything in its power to end the war and to mitigate its impact, both on the suffering people of Ukraine and on vulnerable people in developing countries around the world, and I thank you.
I thank the Secretary-General for his remarks. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Thank you. Madam President, since I last briefed this Council on 17 March, the security situation in Ukraine has seriously deteriorated. The number of Ukrainian civilians killed has more than doubled. Ukrainian cities continue to be mercilessly pounded, often indiscriminately, by heavy artillery and aerial bombardments. And hundreds of thousands of people, including children, the elderly, and the disabled, remain trapped in encircled areas under nightmarish conditions. The devastation wrought on Mariupol and other Ukrainian cities is one of the shameful hallmarks of this senseless war. The horror deepened this past weekend as shocking images emerged of dead civilians, some with hands bound, lying in the streets of Bucha, the town near Kiev formerly held by Russian forces. Many bodies were also found in a mass grave in the same locality. Reports by non-governmental organizations and media also allege summary executions of civilians, rape and looting in Chernihiv, Kharkiv, and Kiev regions. Madam President, away from the fighting, diplomatic efforts to end this war, including direct talks between Ukrainian and Russian representatives, have continued. We commend the government of Turkey for hosting these discussions, as well as the efforts of many others engaging with Russia and Ukraine to help bring about peace. We welcome the willingness of the sides to continue engaging to reach a mutual understanding. This requires good faith and earnest efforts, and progress in the negotiations should be translated quickly into action on the ground. While there has been a reported reduction of Russian troops in attacks around Kiev and Chernihiv, such moves should not be merely tactical, repositioning forces for renewed attacks on Ukrainian cities and towns elsewhere. The General Assembly has twice called for Russian forces to withdraw entirely from Ukrainian territory and cease all military operations. We also take note of the reported withdrawal of Russian forces from around the Chernobyl nuclear site. The International Atomic Energy Agency reports that this development will hopefully allow it to conduct an assistance and support mission to provide technical advice and to deliver equipment where necessary as soon as possible. All nuclear sites in Ukraine must be fully protected and secured. Military operations in or around these locations must be avoided. Madam President, the numbers tell a tragic, if yet incomplete, story. According to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, at least 1,480 civilians have been killed and at least 2,195 injured, between 24 February and 4 April 2022. OHCHR believes that the actual figures are considerably higher. We are gravely concerned by the persistent use of explosive weapons with the wide impact area in or near populated areas. Such weapons are causing most civilian casualties, as well as massive destruction of civilian infrastructure, including residential buildings, hospitals, schools, water stations, and electricity systems. OHCHR has received credible allegations that Russian forces have used cluster munitions in populated areas at least 24 times. Allegations that Ukrainian forces have used such weapons are also being investigated. As noted by the High Commissioner, indiscriminate attacks are prohibited under international humanitarian law and may amount to war crimes. The massive destruction of civilian objects and the high number of civilian casualties strongly indicate that the fundamental principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution have not been sufficiently adhered to. In besieged cities, a significant increase in mortality rates among civilians can also be attributed to the disruption of medical care and basic services. People with disabilities and the elderly are particularly vulnerable. As of 4 April 2022, the World Health Organization has reported a total of 85 attacks on healthcare facilities, resulting in at least 72 fatalities and 43 injuries. Madam President, we are seriously concerned about reports of cases of arbitrary arrests and enforced disappearances of persons who have been vocal against the Russian invasion. As of 30 March, OHCHR has documented the arbitrary detention and possible enforced disappearance of 22 journalists and civil society members in Kyiv, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia regions. 24 local officials have also been detained in regions under Russian control, 13 of whom have been subsequently released. We call for the immediate release of all individuals who have been arbitrarily detained, including journalists, local officials, civil society activists, and others. Also, as of 30 March, OHCHR has recorded 7 journalists and media workers killed since hostilities began. Another 15 have come under armed attack, 9 of whom were injured. Allegations of conflict-related sexual violence perpetrated by Russian forces have also emerged. These include gang rape and rapes in front of children. There are also claims of sexual violence by Ukrainian forces and civil defense militias. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine continues to seek to verify all these allegations. We're also concerned about disturbing videos depicting abuse of prisoners of war on both sides. All prisoners of war must be treated with dignity and full respect for their rights in accordance with international humanitarian law. Madam President, the many credible allegations of serious violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law from areas recently retaken from Russian forces must not go unanswered. We support efforts to examine these allegations and to gather evidence. Ensuring accountability and justice for acts committed during the war will not be easy, but it is essential. Madam President, we are heartened by the generosity of neighboring countries who have accepted millions of refugees and the solidarity of the Ukrainian people who are hosting their displaced compatriots. With more than 10 million people displaced either within Ukraine or abroad as refugees, roughly 1/4 of the population, the United Nations is gravely concerned about the heightened risk of human trafficking. Indeed, suspected and verified cases of human trafficking are surfacing in the surrounding countries, according to the International Organization for Migration. Madam President, this war is devastating Ukraine now, but it also threatens its future. Early assessment projections by UNDP suggest that if the war continues through 2022, Ukraine faces the prospect of seeing 18 years of socioeconomic progress lost. This would set the country and the region back decades and leave deep, long-term social and economic fissures. UN agencies, including UNDP, are working to help preserve Ukraine's hard-won development gains. This involves supporting the government to sustain essential government structures and basic services, including emergency measures to sustain livelihoods, such as cash-based assistance. Madam President, the war in Ukraine has damaged Europe's security architecture. Its economic repercussions are already evident far from the battlefield. The longer the war continues, the greater the risk that it will further weaken the global institutions and mechanisms dedicated to preserve peace and security. The war was started by choice. There is no inevitability to it or to the suffering it is causing. The United Nations is ready to do everything within its means to help bring an end to it. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Carlo for her briefing. And I now give the floor to Mr. Martin Griffiths.
Thank you, Madam President. As you've just heard from the Secretary-General and Under-Secretary-General De Carlo, Ukrainian civilians are paying far too high a price for this war. I want to speak briefly about humanitarian needs and what we're doing to meet them before I then refer to my recent travels. In the last 6 weeks, as we have heard, at least 1,430 people have been killed, among them over 121 children, and we know this is very likely a serious underestimate. Homes and civilian infrastructure, bridges, hospitals, schools have been damaged and destroyed. And in fact, the current figures on displacement tell us that more than 11.3 million people have now been forced to flee their homes, and of that, 4.2 million are now refugees in those generous neighboring countries that Rosemary has just been referring to. So in total, more than a quarter of the population of Ukraine has fled in this extraordinary short time. And unfortunately, we can imagine that these figures will continue to rise until we can find a pause and some peace. Madam President, the ground and air offensives and counteroffensives are making life nearly impossible for many civilians in Ukraine. Families, the elderly, women and children have been trapped by fighting already for too long. For more than 5 weeks, the people of Mariupol have been caught up in the fighting. And it is well documented that really Mariupol is a center of hell. Other cities like Chernihiv, Sumy and Kharkiv remain cut off from essential goods and services. And perilous conditions are hampering our efforts to access civilians or for them to access us. And we restate here that civilians must be allowed to move to safer areas without the fear of attacks and at their own choice and at their own selection. It's vital that all parties to the conflict respect their obligations under international humanitarian law to protect civilians and to allow impartial humanitarian organizations safe, rapid, unimpeded access to all civilians in need wherever they are in Ukraine. Madam President, as the world watches humanitarian needs soar in Ukraine, the United Nations and our partner organizations are making every effort to dramatically increase our support to affected civilians. The work of the 6,000 volunteers from the Ukraine Red Cross, as we have noted before in this chamber, together with local NGOs in eastern Ukraine, these people, these organizations continue to work tirelessly at the front line of assistance to communities. The World Food Programme has reached more than 1.3 million people with cash and food assistance and plans to push that number up to 2.5 million people in this month. Health partners report that more than 180 tons of medical supplies were delivered in Ukraine, with another 470 tons on the way. And this will address the health needs of around 6 million people in the months ahead. And I'm pleased to say, that seems an odd word to say in the context of Ukraine, that after much effort in the past day, another convoy went from our humanitarian hub in Dnipro to the Far East. Today, food, winter clothing, non-food items, medicine, hygiene kits were offloaded to the Ukraine Red Cross and will reach the hands of those most in need. Indeed, following notification to both parties, a formal process that we and also the International Red Cross are engaged in, 4 convoys in total from the UN have provided critical support to people in some of the cities encircled by war and affected by ongoing fighting. Several more are planned. So these are initial steps, but it gives us a basis to now expand and taking our efforts up to scale and expanding much more than 1 convoy a day. As the Secretary General and the Under-Secretary General has already said, I want to also join them in expressing my concern over the growing number of reports we receive of human trafficking, sexual violence, exploitation, and abuse in Ukraine and in the region. And as ever, such horrific incidents as we're seeing there overwhelmingly impact displaced women and children more than others. We're bolstering protection and gender-based violence services through agencies to provide specialized care for survivors and through the wealth of civil society organizations in Ukraine. These services are designed, carried out directly in collaboration with and through Ukrainian civil society, including, very particularly, women-led organizations. Madam President, today I'm addressing you from Geneva, having just returned from Moscow overnight. As you know, the Secretary General, as he said, charged me to bring both sides together on humanitarian grounds to explore both specific and sustained ways to reduce humanitarian suffering, including in particular, inter alia, but in particular, the pursuit of a humanitarian ceasefire. Yesterday in Moscow, I had long and frank exchanges with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, and his deputy, Sergei Vershinin, and then separately with Alexander Fomin, the Deputy Minister of Defense. In my meetings with these senior officials, I discussed also, in addition to these possibilities of humanitarian ceasefires, I discussed the issue of humanitarian convoys of safe passage, including the 4 which I've already referred to. I outlined possibilities for building further on that cooperation, sharing specific suggestions for mutually agreed upon military freezes to allow for evacuation of civilians and for the safe passage of life-saving aid, in effect for humanitarian pauses in different parts of Ukraine to save lives and bring back a modicum of safety for those living in those places. My counterparts in Moscow received these suggestions, assured me of their intent to carefully study those ideas, which I left with them. And we agreed to remain in close contact. And I came away from these meetings believing that we have a very long road ahead of us, but it must be traveled. And Madam President, we will travel it. Tomorrow I plan to travel to Ukraine to have discussions with senior authorities from the Ukrainian government in Kyiv on Thursday on these same issues and others that they will no doubt present to me, and also to see firsthand with our crisis coordinator, Amin Awad, the humanitarian response. Madam President, thanks to generous donor contributions, many from governments in this chamber, the humanitarian response since February has indeed been scaled up, allowing us to meet the needs of 1.5 million people. We will need sustained financial support for needs in Ukraine. And like the Secretary General, I want to stress, as he has done consistently, that funding must not be diverted from other crises. And Madam President, for Afghanistan, that is one example. And as you heard from David Beasley last week, conflict, climate shocks, COVID, compounded by the soaring food and fuel costs indicated by the Secretary General, could push another 47 million people globally into severe food insecurity. And so the total number of people around the world who will not know where their next meal comes from could be driven to the astonishing figure of 325 million people around the world. That is by a long distance the highest in our recent history, and well over double what it was 3 years ago. So, Madam President, I close, of course, like others, by reminding the Council of what the Council already knows well. The world cannot afford this war, and neither can the people of Ukraine. And like others, I call on all Council members and Member States with influence to support all efforts from whatever part they come from in the pursuit of peace and the alleviation of humanitarian suffering, for the sake of the people of Ukraine, for the sake of those around the world who cannot afford to bear the additional burden this war imposes on them and all of us. We must, as the Secretary General said, silence the guns. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Griffiths for his briefing.
For those of you who have just joined us, we're bringing you live coverage now from New York City from the United Nations Conference Building.
You have the floor, sir.
The UN Security Council is meeting. Thank you very much.
Пане Генеральний секретар, шановні члени Радбезу та інші учасники цього засідання. Дякую за можливість. Мене сьогодні почують і всі представники держав-членів.
Thank you to the members of the United Nations Security Council for making this possible. Yesterday I came back from the city of Bucha.
Окупанти не вчинили би там. Російські військові розшукували
It's hard to find a crime that the Russians did not commit.
нашій державі.
The Russian troops were looking to.
Дверима будинків, коли підходили і просто кликали того,
The Russian troops
вони вбивали
were shooting people outside of their houses.
І дітей, і намагались спалити.
They were killing women and children.
Я звертаюсь до вас від імені народу, який
And I am addressing all of you from the nation of Ukraine that every day Ukraine is paying tribute to the people who have died, to the people who have been killed, to the people who have been shot at the back of their head or in the middle of the street, the people who have died in pain.
Давили танками, просто давили танками в цивільних автівках.
People who have been run over with tanks
Заради
in the middle of the day, in the middle of the street, just for pleasure. People who cut hands and legs, who committed rape in front of children, people who cut the tongues of people when they did not want to hear what they had to say. This is different compared to other terror attacks.
Державні кордони, заперечує право більш ніж десятка народів на двох континентах на самовизначення і самостійне державне життя. Проводить
знищення ethnічної
та релігійної різноманітності.
They're pursuing the policy of destroying other nations and other cultures,
щоб зруйнувати якнайбільше звичайні мирні міста.
to destroy
Залишити в країні, куди заводить
as many as possible, to destroy the cities of Ukraine. What about wherever the Russian forces are, there are just ruins left behind? Russia is spreading hatred. They're trying to spread it through the political system with their propaganda.
Закінчиться масштабним політичним хаосом в країнах, де стабільність продовольчих цін – базовий фактор внутрішньої безпеки. Тож,
a policy that could lead to starvation all around the world. Food and prices. Where is the security? There is a council. But where is the peace to guarantee what this organization is trying to guarantee, this institution?
Просто не може ефективно
should take all the occupiers and bring them to peace. But the Council cannot work effectively. The world saw what the Russian troops did in Bucha. They had occupied Bucha. The world has yet to see what they did in other cities, in other occupied cities in Ukraine. In the districts of our country, the geography can be different, but the crimes are the same, and the responsibility should be inevitable. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to remind you of Article 1 of Chapter of the UN about the target of the organisation, the aim to support peace. And now, this mandate has been violated from the first article. And if this is the case, then what's the point with the other articles in the UN? Russians are committing the worst war crimes in Ukraine ever since the end of World War II. Russian troops are deliberately destroying and burning Ukrainian cities with artillery, with airstrikes, blocking cities. They're creating starvation, blocking convoys of civilians who are trying to evacuate. They're also exploding the shelters where civilians are hiding from airstrikes. They're deliberately preying on occupied territories. The mass killings in our cities, in Bucha, this was just one. This is just one of many examples of what the occupiers have been doing in our territory, in our country, for more than a month now. There are other cities that the world has yet to see. They've yet to discover the whole truth. In Mariupol, Kharkiv, and in dozens of other Ukrainian cities. Each of them is like Bucha. I know, and you know very well, that what the representatives of the Russian Federation will say on these claims. They've said it already many times. Particularly after the Malaysian Airlines plane was shot over Donbass. We've heard the same from Syria. They're blaming everyone. They're finding excuses to save themselves. They will say there are lots of different versions, that it is difficult to find the correct version. They also said that the dead bodies were put there, that this was a demonstrated performance. But now, in 2022, there is evidence, there is satellite pictures, there is a possibility to have full, transparent investigations. This is exactly what we want to do. This is what we're interested in doing. We want to give maximum access to journalists and to professional organisations to gain full transparency. I'm sure that every country in the UN should be interested in this. Why? To make sure that once and for all, that we punish the one who thinks that he is privileged, the country that thinks that it is privileged, that it is above all the other countries, and to show to everyone else who has committed war crimes that they will be punished. Because if the biggest criminal is punished, then the others will see, why did Russia come to Ukraine? They want what we have in our country. They've already deported tens of thousands of our citizens. They kidnapped more than 2,000 kids, thousands of kids from all over Ukraine. Russia wants to turn Ukrainians into silent slaves. They're openly looting our cities, stealing things from our cities and villages. This is looting. They steal everything from food to golden earrings, tearing them from the ears of people. We're dealing with a country, the country that has destroyed the security architecture that is asking evil to be unpunished, the country that is destroying everything, that could be working for peace. But if this continues like that, that every country in the UN will only be able to rely on weapons and strength and guns, and not on the system of the international institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, are you ready to shut down the UN? Do you think the time of international law is over? If the answer is no, then you have to act now. You have to act immediately. We have to bring back the power of the mandate of the United Nations. We have to reform the system of the UN to make sure that the right of veto is not the right of death, so that all the regions of the world and that are represented in the UN, if there is an aggressor, they have to be brought to justice immediately. The mass killings from Syria to Somalia to Yemen to Libya, this chain has to be stopped. It should have stopped years ago. But if at least once tyranny doesn't face a response like that,
чесний мир, то світ точно змінився би. І тоді, можливо, не було б війни.
Maybe we wouldn't have had war in Ukraine if this had been stamped out in my country, against our people, against the Ukrainian people, against the civilians, the peaceful people. But the world has been watching and did not want to see it. It probably did not want to see the occupation of Crimea. It did not want to see the war games in Georgia. It did not want to see the annexation and occupation of the whole region of Moldova in the way Russia was preparing the base for other conflicts and wars around its borders. How to stop it? We have to get Russian forces to take responsibility for their crimes that they have committed on the territory of Ukraine. Every single person who gave a criminal order, an execution order, has to go to a tribunal. I want to remind Russian diplomats that after World War II, the punishment these warlords did not escape punishment. Nobody escaped punishment after World War II. Now is the time to transform the system. The system of the United Nations. Together, I suggest we call a global conference, and that we do it in peaceful Kyiv, to see how we're going to transform the global security system. How are we going to guarantee the sovereignty of countries? How are we going to reinstate, to reform the system with respect to law? The values established in 1945, they're not respected. They cannot be respected without a reform. We want to do anything that we can to give to the next generation the efficient, united nations, so that we could prevent these challenges and to guarantee peace and to make aggressors take responsibility and have the possibility of punishing in the principles of peace. There will be no privilege, there will be no exception. Everybody should be equal. All the participants of international relations should be equal, no matter how big the country is or the geopolitical situation in that country. The force of peace should be dominant. And for security, this is how humanity has wanted to operate. Ukraine is ready to participate in the same way as the Office of Geneva is interested in protecting human rights. Ukraine is ready to participate, to have the office in Ukraine. It could be called U24 to prevent and to enable peace. I'd like to remind you of our peaceful mission in Afghanistan. When Ukrainians evacuated over 1,000 people in the worst phase, people needed help and Ukrainians helped. We evacuated people of different religions, different nationalities. Canadians, Ukrainians. We did not look to see who needed help. We were helping everyone, regardless of their nationality. If every time there is a need like that, if every time we can assure that help is coming, the world would be a safer place. This is why Ukraine has the moral right to offer the reform of the global security system, with proof that we are helping the others, not just in good times, but also in bad times. And now we need decisions from the Security Council for peace in Ukraine. And if you don't know how, vote for this decision. You can do two things. Remove Russia and as an aggressor, as the source of war, from blocking the decisions on Russian aggression, Russia's war, and then do everything that can be done to restore peace. Or show how can you transform and to work efficiently for peace, or if the current format has no alternative and if there is no way out, then this is an impasse. I'm sure you can survive with the first two options. Ukraine needs peace. Europe needs peace. The world needs peace. And finally, I am asking, please watch the video. It's not long. Just 1 minute about what came. Because just one person was able to abuse their rights, and this is what happens if there is no punishment. Please watch this video, because not everyone can come to us and see it with their own eyes, so please watch this fragment. Thank you. For those of you who've just joined us, this is Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky addressing the United Nations Security Council.
Do we have the video? They have the video. They have to. I'm not sure. The video, is it just coming?
Now, this is the President's first address to the body since Russia's assault on Ukraine began. He's addressed many Western governments in the past in order to rally support, but this address was certainly expected to be the most passionate one yet, and President Zelensky has certainly delivered.
We will sort that one out technically. We don't have the video. So I propose that while we sort that out, I thank His Excellency Mr. Zelensky for his compelling and powerful remarks. We will come back to the video when we've sorted out the technical issues around it. And may I say, speaking in my national capacity, may I express appreciation to the President for his leadership in wartime and for the extraordinary fortitude and bravery of the Ukrainian people under this unprovoked and illegal invasion. I resume my function as the President of the Security Council, and while we sort out the technical video, I propose to give the floor to those Council members who wish to make statements. And I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me also start by thanking UAE and Ambassador Nisibeh for her successful presidency during the month of March. Madam President, as you begin your Security Council presidency, I want to thank the United Kingdom for your leadership and for organizing this vital discussion on Ukraine today. I also want to thank the Secretary General for his remarks and the other briefers. And I'd like to extend a warm welcome to President Zelensky. I was so moved by the address he made recently to our Congress, and we are truly honored by his presence here under the circumstances that he and Ukraine face today. Madam President, last night I returned from a trip to Moldova and Romania. I saw with my own eyes the refugee crisis caused by Russia's unconscionable war. I spoke to refugees who indicated to me their desires to return to their home. And we've all seen the images on TV of the bombed out buildings. But what we have not seen is that behind those destroyed buildings are destroyed lives and destroyed families. I met with women and children who had fled Ukraine, who stuffed their lives into backpacks and left the only home they had ever known. And these were sobering conversations. One young woman I spoke to came with her 6-year-old brother who had autism and is struggling with cancer. Their single mother helped them escape to save their lives. But Russia's war has interrupted the care her brother desperately needs. Another woman I spoke to fled with her 8-year-old from Odessa. The father, who they'd left behind, told them there was shelling right next to their apartment that very night. And they very well could have died had they not left. A third woman I met told me that she used to love to travel, but never expected her next trip would be to flee for her life. When I asked her where she was from, she started to say, and then she stopped with tears in her eyes and said, "I'm sorry. I don't know how to say it, whether I live in Kyiv or whether I used to live in Kyiv." She was realizing in the moment just how dramatically her life had changed because of this senseless war. These are 3 stories of more than 10 million people, 6 million internally displaced, 4 million who have left Ukraine altogether, 4 million people who have relied on the big-heartedness of countries like Moldova, Romania, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and others across the region and the world to welcome and support all those leaving Ukraine in search of safety. Ukraine's neighbors are bearing the brunt of Europe's most significant refugee crisis since World War II. And I want these countries to know that they have a committed partner in the United States. And that is why the United States announced recently that we are prepared to provide more than $1 billion in new funding toward humanitarian assistance for those affected by Russia's war in Ukraine and its severe impact around the world. And it is why we are welcoming up to 100,000 Ukrainians and others fleeing Russia's aggression to the United States. We will continue to assist humanitarian efforts to help the people of Ukraine and all those fleeing Putin's violence. But as heart-wrenching as the stories are that I heard in Moldova and Romania, there are some stories we will never get to hear. Those of the people we saw in the images out of Bucha. We've all seen the gruesome photos. Lifeless bodies lying in the streets, apparently summarily executed, their hands tied behind their backs. As we work to independently confirm the events depicted in these images, I would remind this Council that based on the currently available information, the United States has assessed that members of Russia's forces have committed war crimes in Ukraine. And even before seeing the images from Bucha, President Zelensky, along with others in the region, were reporting that children were being abducted, and we heard him say that today. Also abducted are mayors and doctors, religious leaders, journalists, and all who dare defy Russia's aggression. Some of them, according to credible reports, including by the Mariupol City Council, have been taken to so-called filtration camps, where Russian forces are reportedly making tens of thousands of Ukrainian citizens relocate to Russia. Reports indicate that Russian federal security agents are confiscating passports and IDs, taking away cell phones, and separating families from one another. I do not need to spell out what these so-called filtration camps are reminiscent of. It's chilling, and we cannot look away. Every day, we see more and more how little Russia respects human rights. And that is why I announced yesterday that the United States, in coordination with Ukraine and many other UN member states, will seek Russia's suspension from the UN Human Rights Council. Given the growing mountain of evidence, Russia should not have a position of authority in a body whose very purpose is to promote respect for human rights. Not only is this the height of hypocrisy, it is dangerous. Russia is using its membership on the Human Rights Council as a platform for propaganda to suggest Russia has a legitimate concern for human rights. In fact, we will hear some of that propaganda here today, I know. And I will not dignify these lies with a response, only to say that every lie we hear from the Russian representative is more evidence that they do not belong on the Human Rights Council. 140 UN member states voted to condemn Russia over its unprovoked war and the humanitarian crisis it has unleashed upon the people of Ukraine. Here's my message to all of you. Now is the time to match those words with action and show the world that we can work responsibly. And I share President Zelensky's view that this moment requires responsible world powers and global leaders to show some backbone and stand up to Russia's dangerous and unprovoked threat against Ukraine and the world. The Secretary General said that confronting this threat is the Security Council's charge. It is, and it is also the responsibility of UN leaders and leaders around the world, every single member state with a voice in the GA. No one can be a shield for Russia's aggression. Suspending Russia from the Human Rights Council is something we collectively have the power to do in the General Assembly. Our votes can make a real difference. Russia's participation on the Human Rights Council hurts the Council's credibility. It undermines the entire UN, and it is just plain wrong. Let us come together to do what is right and do right by the Ukrainian people. Let us take this step to help them to start to rebuild their lives. And let us match the courage of President Zelensky, who we are so honored to have with us today. President Zelensky, I want you to know that we stand with the people of Ukraine as you face down this brutal attack on your sovereignty, on your democracy, and on your freedom. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me thank Ambassador Nusibe for having steered our work during the month of March.
You've been watching the United Nations Security Council in New York. Now, Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine's President, said the UN needs reform and that no country should be given special treatment. He also said that Russia should not be given a special platform to spread lies and propaganda. He called the UN to act and suggested that Kyiv should become the centre for global security talks in the future. He also said we need a court in a similar model to the Nuremberg court to try Russia for its crimes of war. He also said the alleged crimes that have been committed in Bucha is only the beginning and that crimes of similar magnitude have also been committed in other cities, and it is only a matter of time before we see these similar scenes.
Let me thank SG Guterres.
As the war continues in Ukraine, we'll be providing you with more live addresses. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for our news bulletin. Thank you.
You're watching Euronews Now. I'm Takumbo Salako with your top stories. There's growing outrage over mounting human rights atrocities in Ukraine. Kyiv says war crimes and genocide have been committed.